So I promised you all that I'd make this video, and Laezel honestly deserves her own video. I love her so much. And I am a loser of my word, so here it is. It's time to rant about one of my favorite characters, not just in video games, but in all of fiction. And yeah, I recognize how polarizing that statement is. I know that Laezel isn't for everyone, even though she should be. To say she's difficult to get along with is a massive understatement, and in the early days of the fandom, Laezel was kind of like a frog-shaped punching bag for a lot of players. Early access players despised her, and so did a large majority of the people who played the game on release. Online spaces today are much more favorable toward Laezel than they were just a few years ago. But hyper-online fan communities are not exactly the best tell to decide a character's likability. And even still, there is no shortage of steadfast Laezel haters lurking in online forums. As far as I know, Laezel was, and still remains, one of the most underappreciated companions of the core group of Baldur's Gate 3. Larian has released quite a few player statistic infographics over the years, and Laezel constantly finds herself at the lowest possible podium. After the game's opening in 2023, we learned that she was the least popular origin character choice. And by the 1-year anniversary, she'd been dubbed the least romanced female character in the game. And yeah, that does make her the 3rd romance pick overall, but when BG3's audience is mostly straight dudes, that's only really a win on a technicality. And of course, it only takes a cursory Google search to find the waves and waves and waves of hate posts that detail the myriad ways that people detest her. I found her too intense, rude, and disrespectful. Genocidal, prideful, egotistical, fanatical creature seeking beef with everyone. God. She's pragmatic, arrogant, rude, racist. Even romancing her and all the way up to Act 3, it was simply rancid. Disgusting. And you know what? I agree. Except for that last bit about her romance being rancid up until Act 3, but I'm trying not to get ahead of myself here. Yeah, Laezel is kind of a monster. She's an ultra-violent member of a spacefaring, warmongering, isolationist race of xenophobes. She's been honed from birth to be a merciless, lawful evil blade used in the service of a cosmically villainous god queen, and that is exactly why I love her. Now, you're probably thinking that this is just some kind of I can fix her complex, and if that is what you're thinking, then you're definitely correct, but it does go way, way deeper than that. To be specific, it goes about 8,000 words of a script, 2 full playthroughs, and about 100 hours of gameplay footage deeper than that. I genuinely believe that Laezel, across every iteration of her story, is the most well-written character in all of Baldur's Gate 3. And going a few steps further than that, I would say that she's probably one of the greatest examples of the indoctrinated cult member trope that's ever been put to screen. However, I do have one teeny tiny, actually incredibly massive issue with her story. And so, in today's rant, I'm going to be breaking down the character of Laezel. I'm going to be talking about her story, how it entwines with the larger narrative of the game, why it works, and how it all kind of comes apart at the seams right at the very end. And how a few minor tweaks could have made Laezel a perfect character. At least for me. Basically, I'm going to be giving Laezel her due deference, because she does deserve better. She deserves better from players who discount her in favor of more instantly likable companions, and she deserves better from a writing standpoint in one very specific but important way. So whether you're someone who hates Laezel, or you're someone like me who worships the ground she walks on in her weird little sandals, then hopefully this video will give you a new perspective on her character. So if you're down to listen to me gush, then I guess just settle in and prepare for spoilers, because this video will be full of them. Part 1. Why is Laezel? Even if you don't like her, it's undeniable that Laezel is a foundational component of the narrative engine that powers Baldur's Gate 3. She's our POV character in the trailer, which also serves as our opening cinematic. She was front and center for all the marketing, and she's indisputably the companion with the most ties to our main plot. She's the only one with first-hand knowledge and experience with mind flayers and their tadpoles. She's the only one who thinks she has a guaranteed cure for our affliction, and she has personal cultural ties to several of our most impactful story beats, including some of the biggest choices in the game. She's the first person we meet during the tutorial, and might be the only companion that's totally unavoidable, unless you count Will's spotlight moment at the Grove's Gate. By all accounts, she could, and perhaps should, be the main character of this story. Outside of maybe Dirge. But why? Why hang so much of your massively ambitious risk of a game on this angry, domineering frog? Why did Larian make this woman their it girl? Well, we can't really talk about Laezel until we first talk about her voice and mocap actor, Dvorah Wild. She is a huge reason why Laezel's character is as strong as she is. Genuinely, this is one of the most talented voiceover actors in the industry right now, and she deserves way more praise than I can heap on her here. Wild's ability to so comfortably and eloquently slip into the Gith language without sounding like... well...
An Adyrn official who's new in town turns a lot of heads, especially when they're traveling with a Nim dude like Kai.
It's a skill that I think is often overlooked by players, and she brings so much energy and passion into every line she delivers. She really is the lifeblood of Laezel's character, and for that, we should all be thanking our ranch-dressing-obsessed queen. Because video games are a collaborative art form, and Larian were very open to letting their actors get creative, Wild also helped to fill in the little details of Laezel's personality with main writer Kevin Van Ord through years and years of work. Baldur's Gate 3 was put into pre-production in 2017 or 2018, and Dvorah Wild was cast in 2019, meaning that she was around for the majority of the game's development cycle. But even in that early stage, Wild already had a pretty substantial role to fill. Out of all the companions, Laezel actually changed the least from pre-production to the full release. In early access, she was significantly more aggressive toward the player, but I mean, so was everyone.
Chahi, come closer. About you? No.
Her core character traits stayed the same throughout, and so did her story. A big reason for why Laezel didn't really change all that much is that Van Ord actually found her voice very early on. This woman uses beautiful, poetic language to degrade, humiliate, and describe bodily horrors in a way that's almost Lovecraftian in nature, and the spirit of that idea was there right from the beginning. So there was more room for exploration, growth, and narrative ties, since less time was being used to build up her fundamentals. As such, Laezel became a central character in the game, and like I said earlier, maybe even the main character of the game. So I did a little experiment for this video. I played 2 full runs of Baldur's Gate 3 in tandem, which added quite a bit of time to my already embarrassing stats on Steam. I did 1 run as a Gith Tav romancing Laezel, and I did a Laezel origin run. While I have romanced Laezel countless times, I had never actually done a Laezel origin run. Yes, I know, I wasn't helping those opening weekend statistics. Shame me in the comments.
You made me a mockery!
I imagine a lot of you probably haven't even seen a Laezel origin run before, and it really gave me a much deeper appreciation and understanding of her character and her headspace, so let's talk about that one first. Part 2. Laezel and the terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day. Now, typically when I play Baldur's Gate 3, I do keep our frog mommy in my party, and for the whole of the first act, she's always trying to dictate the party's path, right? We all know this. She's overly confident and self-assured. She attempts to tell everyone what to do and where to go and set the pace of the adventure. She wants to be the leader, but instead must suffer the indignity of being a follower. Or at least, that's the energy she gives off. But when I played a Laezel origin run, the energy was very different, and it was an immediate shift, right from the first moments on the Nautiloid. That aforementioned opening cinematic felt a lot more personal when it was my character experiencing the grotesque body horror that is tadpole ocular insertion. And when Laezel woke up alone and confused on the floor of the Nautiloid, the frantic terror of that moment stuck with me. Laezel didn't come off as self-assured in that moment. She was panicking. She persisted through the vile Gake slave vessel, destroyed the Mind Flayer's pet before it could wriggle free of its abominable host, and then came face to face with, this guy. Lucier? Lucier apparently knew Laezel and immediately took an authoritative position over her. He's a direct mirror for Laezel's place in the tutorial. He guides us through the Nautiloid and tells us all the things that she would normally tell us. Stuff like, don't touch the creepy panel, leave the hot goth girl to her fate, and let's get the out of here. But when the Nautiloid crash landed on the beach and Laezel found Lucier dead in the sand, she was on her own. It became her responsibility alone to fulfill her mandate. She had to locate a creche and be purified of the parasite. From that point on, I played Laezel as a fresh-faced, brainwashed soldier. She was staring down the worst fate imaginable for her people, and she was being plagued by dreams of some unfamiliar woman encouraging her to embrace the tadpole's powers. Which, as a side note, I made Laezel's dream guardian an elder Githyanki woman. I figured that this was kind of like an echo of maybe a teacher or a mentor figure she had on Creche K'liir, and it was kind of on theme with Vlaakith as well. In the early access version of the game, our Dream Guardian was supposed to be someone we were especially attracted to. They were literally trying to seduce you, in a very unambiguous and straightforward way. Dude, early access was so horny. Like, I know people complained about the game on launch for being horny, but if you didn't play early access, you don't get it. Anyway, I figured Laezel would lean toward another Gith either for attraction's sake or just based off of blind trust. And so, when the Guardian showed up looking like a Gith, but talking nonsense about embracing the tadpole's powers, of course that only reinforced her single-mindedness. This was gay trickery. Plain and simple. She was terrified, she was in unfamiliar territory, and she was determined to find the one cure for brainworms on this whole Vlaakith-forsaken planet. Meanwhile, every ally she enlisted to traverse the wilderness with had some kind of trivial problem that needed solving lest they keep whining. Laezel is canonically the youngest companion at just 22 years old, so in her mind, she's effectively little more than a teenage babysitter wrangling toddlers. Except she's also skilled in the art of destroying people, which I guess I was at that age too. Going into this run, the one thing that I thought I would have a problem with was finding a valid reason for why Laezel wouldn't just beeline it to the Gith patrol and then from there go to the mountain pass Creche, but that turned out to not be a problem at all. When playing as Laezel, she doesn't know about Zorru or the Grove, so she has no lead on her people's whereabouts. And it was actually really easy to just walk by Zorru once I got in the Grove because this is Laezel. She's not going to stop to interrogate every sniveling tiefling she comes across. She's going to seek out the people in power and question them directly. And also while in the Grove, Laezel ran into a familiar-looking, dark-haired Istik. On Lucier's instruction, she had left the woman to her doom on the Nautiloid and was surprised to see her reappear, very much alive and surrounded by fallen intellect devourers on the sands of the Sword Coast. They quarreled, but Laezel eventually left the Istik to her own devices, opting instead to accept the allyship of a strange wizard, an emaciated elf, and a soft-hearted swordsman. All could be easily overpowered, so they were no threat to her, but they could prove useful in battle. But here again was this woman, sitting on a rock in the grove, fiddling with some strange object. When Laezel caught a glimpse of it, she surmised that it was a Gith artifact. She decided to recruit the loathsome woman to determine how she might have come into possession of such a thing. But first, she had to earn her trust. And yes, I did romance Shadowheart as Laezel for this origin run, because I'm a degenerate, and I was practically raised on enemies to lovers fanfiction, okay? For a little while after that, my Laezel origin run felt pretty much like a standard playthrough. I hit all the regular beats, just with a much stronger hand than I would normally apply while roleplaying my characters. She threatened a devil. She cleansed the blighted village of the Goblin Menace. She felled a pack of gnolls and stumbled on the burning wreckage of Joaquin's Rest, all in pursuit of her singular goal: find her people and be cleansed. Laezel decided to help Karlach because she seemed like the strongest possible ally she'd come across thus far, and was beginning to think that she'd underestimated the perils of the Faerun Wilds. So she took her back to the Druid's Grove to meet with Dammon, and on that return trip, she finally came across Zorru, who gave her the lead that she needed. From there, she rushed to her people, and despite protestations from the rest of the party, she did approach the Gith Patrol and tell them of her infection. And let's just say it didn't go as she expected. She and the rest of her companions barely made it out of the resulting battle alive, and Laezel was left more than a little confused. She had followed protocol. Why would her kin turn on her like this? A Githyanki slate plucked from one of her kin's dead bodies told Laezel that there was a creche located somewhere in the nearby mountain pass. But this encounter had left her shaken. She was nearly killed, and there was no guarantee that these other Gith wouldn't just slaughter her on sight the moment that she got there. If she was going to pursue this creche, then she had to prepare. She needed to stock up on supplies and recruit stronger allies, so perhaps this druid Halsin would suffice. Laezel infiltrated the goblin camp and freed the druid, inadvertently clearing the way for the tiefling refugees to head forth on their journey to Baldur's Gate. They insisted on showing their gratitude through a night of merrymaking, and once everyone was asleep, she and Shadowheart had a weary but surprisingly romantic conversation. They'd built up an uneasy respect and rapport over their shared strength and devotion to their respective goddesses, while Laezel was trying to needle her for information about the Gith artifact, and one thing led to another. In the morning, the group headed straight for the mountain pass, and this is where things got interesting. Obviously, she had to strike down the woman demanding a Githyanki egg, and when she approached the creche, she did so with extreme caution. The only person she told of her infection was the Gustil, who instructed her to sit in the Zaith'isk for extraction, which almost killed her. Again. At this point, Laezel's only hope was to speak to the Inquisitor directly, the highest possible authority figure that she could get to, And once she got to his definitely not a boss room, she came face to face with Vlaakith herself. On her queen's order, Laezel tried to murder the Dream Guardian who alluded to some secret that Vlaakith was hiding. Laezel paid those words no mind and thrust the sword directly into the Guardian's chest, only to return to the material plane and discover that Vlaakith put a price on her head. The Gith had turned on her, even though the only thing that she'd done is follow the rules exactly as they were laid out for her. That night, while suffering from the wounds inflicted by her own people, Laezel tossed and turned and, for the first time in her life, doubted the words of her teachers and her queen. Those doubts were further exacerbated by Voss's appearance at camp, and while every word he spoke rang like blasphemy in her jaggedly pointed ears, Laezel knew in her heart that they were true. She has a great line at this moment if you're not playing as her, and she said it during my romance run, so I'll just play it here.
If Voss speaks true, if Ascension is a lie, if tadpole purification is a fairy tale, then I have not sinned against Vlaakith. She has sinned against me.
From there, progress was slow but steady. Laezel wasn't fully ready to let go of all of her harmful beliefs and behaviors, but her eyes had been opened to new possibilities, and she was exploring them. She grew to appreciate her companions as people rather than pawns on a battlefield. She rescued Minthara from Moonrise and listened to her harrowing stories of forced indoctrination. She watched Shadowheart cast aside her cruel goddess and admired the strength of will such an act required. She aided in the liberation of the land from the Shadow Curse, and saw what goodness and light can do for the world. And she met the living Prince Orpheuss, undeniable proof of Vlaakith's lies and weakness, and a symbol of freedom for the Githyanki people, if he could only be untethered from his chains. So when it finally came time to come face to face with Vlaakith again in Act 3, Laezel was more than ready. She cast the Undying Queen aside, freeing herself from the bonds of her tyrannical leader, and at the end of the game, she climbed atop a red dragon to fight alongside her newly freed prince, with the ultimate goal of ending Vlaakith's reign and bringing an age of peace for the Gith. All of that sounds pretty great, right? Laezel's story was tied up in a neat little bow. She learned to be less of an aggressively rude hardass to her friends. She made friends in the first place. She broke free of the harmful ideologies of the cult that raised her, and she sailed off into the sunset to do the same for her people. But Ash, I hear you saying, what if you do an evil run with Laezel? Well, friend, that's a great question. There are two main bad endings for Laezel as an origin character, and they're as follows. The first is if she decides to lean into Vlaakith through the whole game and commit herself to her queen. Then she'll ascend, which basically means her soul is going to be harvested, and she'll become a husk of her former self so that Vlaakith might finally become a true goddess. The second evil ending is the absolute path. If Laezel takes control of the Elder Brain, she becomes all-powerful and no longer has need for Vlaakith. She summons a red dragon and goes off to murder the Undying Queen and replace her as the new ruthless tyrant who will rule over the Githyanki as a slave race. And again, I do love all of this. I genuinely think that no matter which path you choose here, it's the tightest plot thread in the game with the strongest and most powerful send-off from an emotional standpoint. Either Laezel unlearns the damaging teachings of her death cult and becomes a kinder, more empathetic person with a noble goal, or she follows her cult to its inevitable conclusion and it swallows her whole, or she continues the cycle and she pushes the cult further to create an even worse environment than the one that she was raised in. It's incredible, I adore it, tattoo her face on my face. But after all that, we still haven't addressed one very important matter. We made it all the way through to the end of the game, and I never brought up my massive problem with Laezel. Did I lie to you? Was this all a ruse to make you sit here and listen to me talk about how great Laezel is? Kinda. But not really. In order for me to really lay out my problem with Laezel, we needed the structure of her story to be fresh in our minds. We needed to understand her motivations and actions and have a solid idea of where she ends up, both literally and metaphorically at the end of the game. So with all that groundwork laid, we can finally discuss the issue. And that discussion starts with a question. Part 3. What is Laezel's story actually about? The easiest answer to this question is that Laezel's story is about violence, power, and the strength that it takes to step away from the temptations of both. It's about rising above vicious cruelty and instead summoning the bravery to be virtuous and gentle. And it's about our responsibility to stand up against injustices and oppressive systems wherever we can. But all of that isn't just important to Laezel's story, it's important to the story of Baldur's Gate as a whole. We can follow the trails of those themes through most of our companions' arcs as well as the main plot. There's gotta be something that's unique to her, right? Something that's been nurtured from the beginning that were meant to associate with her story specifically. And with that in mind, I want to rewind back to that Gith Lucier that we met during the tutorial of Laezel's origin run. At no point does Laezel try to assert dominance over this loser. She is content to be told what to do, even though gameplay-wise, she is typically the one in that leadership position. She is the one leading us through the tutorial. And we kinda know this about her, right? Sometimes when you stand up to her in game, she approves of your actions, and she's respectful of Gith authority figures across the board for the entire first act. There's an early moment in her romance where, depending on your dialogue choice, she will specifically admit to admiring you because you are the leader of the group. On a fundamental level, Laezel doesn't mind being led as long as that leader is strong and capable. Actually, I think she defaults to being led, and that is the main flaw that she's meant to overcome. She's too passive.
In Creche K'liir, a formal greeting begins with a bow. Lower.
Hear me out. When I was reading out those excerpts from hate posts earlier, one of the main complaints was that Laezel is arrogant, pushy, and rude. She wants to assume control. She thinks she knows what's best for everyone and tries to force them to do it. In the real world, these traits are often linked with abusers and manipulators and just the worst kinds of people imaginable. But within the safety of fantasy and through the context of her story, we can see that for Laezel, these actions are just a manifestation of a lifetime of pain and fear. She is a caged animal doing whatever she thinks is necessary to survive, even if those actions are ultimately detrimental. Anyone who approaches her with kindness is going to be lashed out at, but she has experience with cruelty, so anyone who asserts themselves over her is going to be able to pacify her rage and force her to fall in line. But either way, she's never actually in control. She's either a fully chaotic entity desperately clawing for safety and stability, or she's letting someone else make her decisions for her. She needs to learn to take secure control of her life, and that, I believe, is what her story is really about. That's why her separation from Vlaakith and her detangling from her cultish beginning is so powerful, because she's ripping herself away from the dangerous comfort of conformity. That's why her evil endings are so poignant, because she either succumbs to her conformist tyrant or becomes one herself. And that is why this one moment hurts me so much.
Shma Salah Orpheuss, ma stilna forging in Yeri. Orpheus's will above all. May the comet blaze our path forward.
Orpheus's will above all. This line is taken from a speech that occurs immediately after Laezel renounces Vlaakith in Act 3, which means that the second she frees herself from the control of one leader, she binds herself to the will of another. And this is my problem with Laezel. This moment is tragic in a way that I believe is unintentional, because this is meant to be Laezel's good ending. Fighting alongside the morally good Prince Orpheuss is the righteous, correct thing to do. But for some reason, that beat was written in a way that totally destroys every lesson that Laezel was meant to learn up until that very second. To be fair, we are given a dialogue choice that echoes the same sentiment, because an incredible writer like Kevin Van Ord was 1,000 steps ahead of me and probably saw all of this coming a million miles away. The choice reads, "You've been quick to pledge yourself to Orpheus's cause. What about your own needs and wants?" A fair question in my opinion, and this is what Laezel has to say for herself.
Orpheus's freedom is my want and my need. To deny his freedom would be to deny my own. There will come a time when I can think about myself beyond the Lich Queen who enslaves the Githyanki and the prince who would liberate them. But that time won't come until the Prince of the Comet flies again.
From a bird's eye view of the narrative, this answer does make sense. Even after Laezel has broken free of her indoctrination, she still loves her people. She can't just go off and eat, pray, love her way around the world while they suffer under a false queen. But it's the way that they've written this decision that really gets to me. And for the record, that eat, pray, love style ending is actually an option. You can convince Laezel to stay with you, and I find that equally objectionable, even though on a surface level, it does feel like the most autonomous choice. Telling Laezel to stay with you feels odd, especially after everything that I've outlined about her leapfrogging from authority figure to authority figure. It does feel as though we're just pulling Laezel in another direction rather than letting her forge her own path. I do like the idea of Laezel finding beauty, value, and meaning in a planet that she was so quick to write off at the beginning of her journey. And I think that that's a cute reflection of how we as players tend to write off Laezel as soon as we meet her. But as she spells out for us, Vlaakith's faithful will continue to hunt her for the rest of her life. The fight isn't over, and she won't know peace until her people's chains have been broken. From both a literal and thematic standpoint, her past still haunts her, and she'll never be able to distance herself from that as long as Blackith remains in power. So that really puts a damper on the idea that she might make a life for herself in Faerûn. She will always have to fight, and so she might as well fight more directly and with more purpose on the astral plane. But again, we come back to this line.
Orpheuss Will above all.
And we have to address what it means for Laezel's character. For the record, I do agree with the teachings and philosophies of the comet. As Laezel outlines,
No chains to bind us, no lies to bury us. Liberty will be the rallying cry that unites our empire.
but just because I agree with the cause doesn't mean that I find Laezel's instant and all-consuming fanaticism palatable after we spent 2/3 of the game deprogramming her from this exact mindset. She literally learned her lesson 30 real-life seconds ago, and here she is retreading those same murky waters. That wasn't a frog joke, but it probably should have been. And by the way, this is all made so much worse when you're romancing her. Part 4. Kissing the Frog. Playing through a romance run alongside my Laezel origin run was a really enlightening experience. It helped to keep me informed of what our frog queen might be thinking at any given moment. It helped to put me in her headspace as well as my characters, and it helped me empathize with even the worst of her misinformed actions or pointed insults. And this is not me recommending that you also do a tandem run. I did this because I'm an obsessive weirdo, and I'm telling you about it specifically so you don't also follow in my footsteps. You should go outside, enjoy the sunshine. I won't be taking my advice, but you should. I played a Gith warlock Tav who sold their soul to their patron in order to escape their creche. Before they were scooped up onto the Nautiloid, they were roaming Faerûn effectively as a mercenary, scrounging up enough gold to get by and prioritizing self-preservation above all else. Coming face to face with one of their kin wasn't exactly ideal, and when fate demanded that they meet again just outside the Druid's Grove, my Tav refused to ally themselves with a Gith who was still so ingrained in the teachings of the Death Cult. They went their separate ways and only saw each other again when Tav and the rest of the group happened upon the Gith patrol at the edge of the mountain pass. There, my Tav watched Laezel be betrayed and attacked by their own people, and against their better judgment, they took pity on her. They recruited her into the party, and things took a turn. Together, they bettered themselves through their adventures. My Tav helped Laezel step outside her rigid thinking, and that in turn taught my Tav to care for others. And on a broader scale, Laezel's passion for freeing the Githyanki taught my Tav to care for the plight of their people. This is my personal canon romance. I've played it through multiple times now, and I eat it up every single time. I know a lot of players think that you have to slog through the first 2 acts to get to the good stuff in a Laezel romance, but I reject that notion. In order to fully appreciate the softer side of Laezel that we're eventually privy to, we have to help crack her shell. And it's not like that shell is impenetrable. She actually lets us in on some pretty vulnerable personal information before her very first romance-specific cutscene. It's just that she hides the information behind a veneer of austerity and pride, and so I think a lot of players miss the meaning behind the words. When Laezel first admitted she was attracted to my Tav, they asked, "If you respect me so much, then why are you such a prickly grouch?" And Laezel's response was extremely revealing.
If you must know, Vlaakith requires everything of her children. Think of how many bruises you've inflicted, how much blood you've drawn in the undying Queen's name. I know only blood red and death black. My mind is silver, and my body steel. I am what I must be, say what I must be, to survive every beast I face and every wound I bear.
Laezel could have easily said, "I act like a prickly grouch because I am one." But instead, she said, "I act like a prickly grouch because I have to be one." In other words, she doesn't necessarily want to be the way that she is. She was made that way through years of torturous training. That is a very distinct difference, and it hints at the sweetness under her sour exterior. And if you're patient with her and you let that sweetness surface, then you're ultimately rewarded tenfold. The very first time I romanced Laezel, I contextualized her arc as her throwing away her protective shield and willingly showing us her soft underbelly. She disengages enough from her hard-edged upbringing to realize that she deserves comfort and compassion, both as a giver and a receiver. And she relinquishes control to us, her partner, as a way of demonstrating her trust and affection. And I still love that read. But if her story is actually about her becoming the leader of her own life, then that's not what's happening here. She isn't relinquishing control, she's sharing in it. Our character becomes a gateway that Laezel can walk through to discover that she's her own person with wants, needs, and autonomy. And that perspective really changes the meaning of lines like this one.
Truthfully, it took more courage to ask for a soft touch than it would to meet the gaze of the ninefold dragon.
This isn't about her learning to be kind. This is about her learning that she can ask for things. Now you might be thinking, Ash, what the hell are you talking about? Have you ever heard Laezel speak? She's never been afraid to ask for anything.
Enough talk. I will be plain. I want to taste you. Perhaps tonight, perhaps later. But I want it all the same.
But let's remember that caged animal analogy I used earlier. This is not a sincere, emotionally secure expression of desire. This is aggression on like multiple levels. This is a wild, flailing attack from a person that's fiercely grasping for control, and the only way she's seemingly able to attain it is through the physical act of sex. And it is purely physical. There are several dialogue options early on in the Laezel romance arc that are dedicated to pointing out how little affection there is between her and your character. Even after the big fight scene in Act 2, Laezel doesn't fully detach from that deeply ingrained Githyanki ideology. She still believes that the best that she can hope for in a relationship is, in her words, a flesh bond. My Tav became the source of her bruises. We left scars on each other's bodies because that's the only type of affection that Laezel was ever told she was allowed to have. Only at the end of her arc did that pet name evolve into source of her joy, signifying that she was finally allowing herself the freedom of emotional intimacy. Before being with Tav, Laezel had never even cuddled someone before, but by the end of her story, she learns that she wants steel and silk. She wants to protect you and to be protected by you in turn, and she asks for it. For so long, she was in pursuit of the ambitions of other people, of other authorities, and now she's finally confident enough to center herself physically and emotionally. Those late-game conversations are her claiming control and power, and that's really powerful. It adds to the strength of her story, and it really bulks up the already considerable growth of her character by the time Act 3 rolls around. And then she turns around and devotes herself to a new God King, erasing much of that progress. That Eat, Pray, Love ending I mentioned earlier, the one where you convince Laezel to stay with you on Faerun, it's a little more justifiable on a romance run because you're committing to staying with her, but it's not enough. Especially when she has lines like,
I abandoned my prince for you.
While she reassures us that she's cool with it, it just doesn't sit right with me. I think this is meant to be similar in vibes to Shadowheart's let's settle on a farm with 1,000 animals thing. It's the hero living a quiet life of tranquility. It's a pastoral fantasy, but that's not actually possible for Laezel, as we already discussed, so that's kind of off the table, and it doesn't really fit her personality anyway. As much as I would love to headcanon a Lapis and Peridot style homesteading fantasy with Laezel and Shadowheart, it just doesn't work. If we're being honest, the writers really backed themselves into a corner with this story, and since Vlaakith and Orpheuss are such load-bearing pillars of the narrative, and Laezel is so tightly bound between them, there really was no other direction for her story to take her, which is pretty ironic considering the themes of that story. The options that she gets in-game are the best that we could possibly hope for, unless we want to do like a whole rewrite of the main plot, which we're not doing that. Not today, at least. But I do hold firm that with a few minor changes, the most glaring issues could have been minimized or totally overcome. So, what are these changes? Part 5. So, what are these changes? The first and most obvious change is to just cut the Orpheuss Will line from her big freedom speech altogether. Laezel can still fight alongside Prince Orpheuss without literally swearing an oath of allegiance to him. And in fact, cutting this line would actually be an indication that Orpheuss as a ruler would be radically different from and better than Vlaakith, because he doesn't require blind devotion and loyalty from his followers. I'm already weary of the fact that we're just trading one monarch for another, more divinely chosen monarch, but this is Dungeons & Dragons. Kings and queens are an expected staple of the universe. We're not going to get into the inherent problems with monarchy as a system of governance right now. This video is about Laezel, so what should she say if not Orpheuss Will above all? Well, I did a quick re-edit of what her speech could have sounded like, but first, for context, let's just look at the speech as is in the finished game.
I have what I have gathered for myself. I'm moored to a new regent, a new land, and new allies. I am known and honored by you, the source of my bruises. Vlaakith cannot unmake she who no longer exists. And so, from the old battle cries is birthed another. Shma Salar Orpheuss, Ma Stilna Fortune in Yeri. Orpheus's will above all. May the comet blaze our path forward.
And now I humbly present my version. Imagine, if you will, it's the morning after Laezel has officially disentangled herself from Vlaakith's clutches. For the first time, she is unbound and unburdened. She stands, facing toward the dawn of a new day, and proclaims,
I have what I have gathered for myself. I'm moored to a new land, and new allies. Little is lost. So much is gained. Last night will be forever branded into my memory. But now, I must think of future days. There will come a time when I can think about myself beyond the Lich Queen who enslaves the Githyanki and the prince who would liberate them. But that time won't come until the Prince of the Comet flies again. To deny his freedom would be to deny my own.
Obviously, I've taken bits from multiple voice lines and scenes here, but doesn't that just sound more like a woman who just learned she could think for herself for the first time? Aren't those words filled with promise and potential? Importantly, it still gets us to the same mission statement. She's still directed toward freeing Orpheuss and fighting Vlaakith, but it matters how we get there. It matters how that mission statement is stated. Rather than Laezel ending her speech affirming the will of the prince, as she does in the finished game, this re-edit ends on her desire for freedom without us having to ask any follow-up questions. It also removes the mention of her being moored to a new regent and places a heavier emphasis on her personal experiences and the healthy, equal relationships that she's forged along the way. Basically, it tells us that she's her own person. Another change I'd like to see, just to hammer home that idea of autonomy and personhood, comes right at the end of the game during the final party scene. As it stands in the finished game, if you didn't convince Laezel to stay with you in Faerun, then she appears as a projection during the party. She informs us that this is because she's off fighting the good fight on the astral plane, so she can't be there in person. And neither can you, if you chose to saddle up behind her and ride off on her dragon at the end of the game. I already have a few problems with this. First of all, the game isn't shy about showing us multiple ways in which people jump from plane to plane throughout the course of the story. We've got Gith opening portals left and right, and there's a whole device dedicated to being able to teleport back and forth. So this feels like a strange choice. But my main beef with Laezel's projected self is this throwaway line.
It has taken all of Orpheus's efforts to conjure our projections here, and all of mine to convince him to let us come.
So, for some reason, Orpheuss can't just conjure a portal, which is its own thing. These projections are apparently taking all of his power, which is just kind of sad, really. But this also implies that Laezel needed to ask permission to attend this party, and that Orpheuss really did not want her to go. He was even leaning toward forbidding it. And to that I ask, why? Why give Laezel this incredibly rich story about her becoming her own person, only to ceremoniously bind herself to a new king who then restricts her access to the material plane and appoints himself the authority over whether or not she's allowed to see her friends? I understand that Laezel is a necessary piece of the rebellion's puzzle. I understand that she has official duties and that those duties are of galactic importance. But this is just such a backslide in terms of her characterization, and it would have been so easy to just not write it this way. Laezel absolutely could have attended this party in person. I already rhymed off a couple of ways in which she could have instantly found herself there, and if she was needed in like an emergency situation, she could have instantly found her way back just as easily. But I'm also not totally opposed to the projection. It gives us a real sense of how far away she is from the rest of the group, how otherworldly and grand her mission is, and how high the stakes are for her and her people. However, if we're keeping the projection, we are not keeping this bullshit line about her having to persuade Orpheuss to let her go to the party. Similar to the bit about Orpheus's will above all, I think we should just leave this line on the cutting room floor. Interestingly, a different and better version of this line does exist in-game, but you only hear it if you choose one very specific ending. And it's the ending that I think makes the most sense for Laezel's story. It fixes a lot of my problems, but it doesn't fix the root, so let's run that down really quick. Part 6. The good ending, in my opinion. As everyone who's ever finished a playthrough of Baldur's Gate 3 knows, at the end, someone's gotta turn into a mind flayer. Your only way out of that deal is by being evil or letting Gale blow himself up, which, I mean, it isn't off the table, but It isn't ideal. Your choices for mind flayerification are your player character, Karlach, or Prince Orpheuss. And if you want Laezel's happiest possible ending, then, in my opinion, you've gotta squidify Orpheuss. That's the only ending wherein Laezel isn't tied to the whims of a ruler. She can choose her own path and fight for her people on her own terms. Orpheuss gets to nobly sacrifice himself for the Githyanki, and Laezel gets to be her own person. It's a win-win. And during that final party scene, Laezel makes it known that she personally went through a lot to project herself and see her friends again.
It's taken a dozen Gish's talents, a few stolen psi crystals, and 10 days of effort to conjure my projection.
This is so much better on every conceivable level. Not only is she implying that she cares enough about her friends to go through all of that effort, which is adorable, but she did it because she wanted to. There was no one there to try and stop her or forbid her from trying. Yes, her fight is considerably harder without the legendary Orpheuss to point to as proof of Vlaakith's false claims to the throne, but that is a fair trade when it ties a stronger knot at the end of Laezel's personal plot threads. Even still, there are a few strange choices in the writing of this arc that stand out as missteps to me, and they spoil what would otherwise be a perfect end to her story. First of all, that whole Orpheuss's will thing happens well before he sprouts tentacles, and Laezel never backtracks on that way of thinking. She takes up the mantle of the comet for herself, which is great, but I wish she was more direct in her ability to take control of her own life. When she brings up meeting with the God King of the Githzerai, she even goes out of her way to say that it has fallen to her to secure an alliance. She didn't seek him out herself or confer with other rebel Gith to determine their best allies. Somebody else reached out, and now it's up to Laezel to go and meet the king. It's all very passive. And second, even as a mind flayer, Orpheuss practically commands Laezel to take up the mission to destroy Vlaakith.
But first, Laezel, I need your promise. Carry my hope. Carry my burden. Destroy Vlaakith. Release our people.
Of course, this is what Laezel wants, so it's portrayed as a fine thing for him to say. But wouldn't it have been just as easy for Laezel to step forward in that moment and tell Orpheuss herself that she plans on continuing the mission? Why is he still calling upon her like she's some duty-bound soldier? This is just another small moment where her agency takes a back seat for reasons that are totally baffling to me. Ultimately, I still think that Squidfeus is the best ending for Laezel. Squidfeus? Orpheuss? Prince of the Calamari. I don't know. Pick your favorite. But realistically, none of Laezel's endings do enough to totally conclude the most important and unique element of her story. None of them give her the full personhood that her arc warrants, and that's disappointing because she deserves better. However, let's not get things twisted. It is a massive triumph that all of this can be true. I can firmly believe everything I just said, and yet the fact remains that Laezel is an incredibly robust character. She's my favorite character. Even taking into account all of my criticisms, I've always found her arc to be the most rewarding to see play out. Her narrow worldview expands and unfolds so expertly over the events of the game. She's always watching, studying and surveying until that terrified, trapped animal finds the courage to let herself out of her cage. To go from this...
You may as well suggest a wyvern bow to worms.
...to this...
What good? This heart of stone, for it to be shattered.
...to this...
I lived for the red of blood and the black of death. Now, I see the colors between.
Kevin Van Ord, Dvorah Wild, and the rest of the developers at Larian who had a hand in shaping this woman should be ridiculously proud of the work they did to bring Laezel to players, and I can only really be sad that there isn't more of her. Like, seriously, I don't know how you can look at this face and not fall in love with this frog. If you've made it all the way to the end of this video and you've never given Laezel a chance, then hopefully I've encouraged you to do so. And if you already loved her like I did, then welcome to the Laezel fan club. Meetings are on Thursdays. You can astral project yourself into Creche K'liir because we renovated it and turned it into a clubhouse. Bye! First of all, the Orpheuss. Okay. First of all, the